Section 6 of A Little Tour of France by Henry James. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The cathedral is not the only lion of Bourges. The house of Jacques Coeur is an object of interest scarcely less positive. This remarkable man had a very strange history, and he too was broken, like the wretched soldier whom I did not stay to see. He has been rehabilitated, however, by an age which does not fear the imputation of paradox, and a marble statue of him ornaments the street in front of his house. To interpret him according to this image, a womanish figure in a long robe and a turban, with big bare arms and a dramatic pose, would be to think of him as a kind of truculent sultana. He wore the dress of his period, but his spirit was very modern. He was a Vanderbilt or a Rothschild of the 15th century. He supplied the ungrateful Charles VII with money to pay the troops who, under the heroic Maid, drove the English from French soil. His house, which today is used as a Palais de Justice, appears to have been regarded at the time it was built very much as the residence of Mr. Vanderbilt is regarded in New York today. It stands on the edge of the hill on which most of the town is planted, so that behind it plunges down to a lower level, and if you approach it on that side, as I did, to come round to the front of it, you have to ascend a longish flight of steps. The back, of old, must have formed a portion of the city wall. At any rate, it offers to view the two big towers which Joanne says were formerly part of the defence of Bourges. From the lower level of which I speak, the square in front of the post office, the palace of Jacques Coeur looks very big and strong and feudal. From the upper street, in front of it, it looks very handsome and delicate. To this street it presents 2 stories and a considerable length of facade, and it has, both within and without, a great deal of curious and beautiful detail. Above the portal in the stone work are 2 false windows, in which 2 figures, a man and a woman, apparently household servants, are represented in sculpture as looking down into the street. The effect is homely, yet grotesque, and the figures are sufficiently living to make one commiserate them for having been condemned, in so dull a town, to spend several centuries at the window. They appear to be watching for the return of their master, who left his beautiful house one morning and never came back. The history of Jacques Coeur, which has been written by M. Pierre Clément in a volume crowned by the French Academy, is very wonderful and interesting, but I have no space to go into it here. There is no more curious example, and few more tragical, of a great fortune crumbling from one day to the other, or of the antique superstition that the gods grow jealous of human success. Merchant, millionaire, banker, shipowner, royal favorite and minister of finance, explorer of the East and monopolist of the glittering trade between that quarter of the globe and his own, great capitalist who had anticipated the brilliant operations of the present time, he expiated his prosperity by poverty, imprisonment, and torture. The obscure points in his career have been elucidated by M. Clément, who has drawn, moreover, a very vivid picture of the corrupt and exhausted state of France during the middle of the 15th century. He has shown that the spoliation of the great merchant was a deliberately calculated act, and that the king sacrificed him without scruple or shame to the avidity of a singularly villainous set of courtiers. The whole story is an extraordinary piece of high-handed rapacity, the crudest possible assertion of the right of the stronger. The victim was stripped of his property, but escaped with his life, made his way out of France, and betaking himself to Italy, offered his services to the Pope. It is proof of the consideration that he enjoyed in Europe, and of the variety of his accomplishments, that Calixtus III should have appointed him to take command of a fleet which his Holiness was fitting out against the Turks. Jacques Coeur, however, was not destined to lead it to victory. He died shortly after the expedition had started, in the island of Chios, in 1456. The house of Bourges, his native place, testifies in some degree to his wealth and splendour, though it has in parts that want of space which is striking in many of the buildings of the Middle Ages. The court, indeed, is on a large scale ornamented with turrets and arcades, with several beautiful windows, and with sculptures inserted in the walls, representing the various sources of the great fortune of the owner. M. Pierre Clement describes this part of the house as having been of an incomparable richesse, an estimate of its charms which seems slightly exaggerated today. There is, however, something delicate and familiar in the bas reliefs of which I have spoken, little scenes of agriculture and industry, which show that the proprietor was not ashamed of calling attention to his harvests and enterprises. Today we should question the taste of such allusions, even in plastic form, in the house of a merchant prince, say in the Fifth Avenue. Why is it, therefore, that these quaint little panels at Bourges do not displease us? It is perhaps because things very ancient never, for some mysterious reason, appear vulgar. This 15th-century millionaire, with his palace, his egotistical sculptures, may have produced that impression on some critical spirits of his own day. The portress who showed me into the building was a dear little old woman, with the gentlest, sweetest, saddest face, a little white, aged face, with dark, pretty eyes, and the most considerate manner. She took me up into an upper hall, where there were a couple of curious chimney pieces and a fine old oaken roof, the latter representing the hollow of a long boat. There is a certain oddity in a native of Bourges, an inland town if there ever was one, without even a river to call a river, to encourage nautical ambitions. Having found his end as admiral of a fleet, but this boat-shaped roof, which is extremely graceful and is repeated in another apartment, would suggest that the imagination of Jacques Coeur was fond of riding the waves. Indeed, as he trafficked in Oriental products and owned many galleons, it is probable that he was personally as much at home in certain Mediterranean ports as in the capital of the pastoral Berry. If, when he looked at the ceilings of his mansion, he saw his boats upside down, this was only a suggestion of the shortest way of emptying them of their treasures. He is presented in person above one of the great stone chimney pieces, in company with his wife, Massé de Léodepart. I like to write such an extraordinary name. Carved in white stone, the two sit playing at chess at an open window, through which they appear to give their attention much more to the passers-by than to the game. They are also exhibited in other attitudes, though I do not recognize them in the composition on top of one of the fireplaces, which represents the battlements of a castle, with the defenders, little figures between the crenellations, hurling down missiles with a great deal of fury and expression. It would have been hard to believe that the man who surrounded himself with these friendly and humorous devices had been guilty of such wrong-doing as to call down the heavy hand of justice. It is a curious fact, however, that Bourges contains legal associations of a purer kind than the prosecution of Jacques Coeur, which, in spite of the rehabilitations of history, can hardly be said yet to have terminated, inasmuch as the law courts of the city are installed in his quondam residence. At a short distance from it stands the Hôtel Cujas, one of the curiosities of Bourges, and the habitation for many years of the great jurisconsult, who revived in the 16th century the study of Roman law, and professed it during the close of his life in the university of the capital of Berry. The learned Cujas had, in spite of his sedentary pursuits, led a very wandering life. He died at Bourges in the year 1590. Sedentary pursuits is perhaps not exactly what I should call them, having read in the BIOGRAPHY universelle, sole source of my knowledge of the renowned Cujacius, and his usual manner of study was to spread himself on his belly on the floor. He did not sit down, he lay down, and the BIOGRAPHY universelle has, for so grave a work, an amusing picture of the short, fat, untidy scholar dragging himself à plat ventre across his room from one pile of books to the other. The house in which these singular gymnastics took place, which is now the headquarters of the gendarmerie, is one of the most picturesque at Bourges. Dilapidated and discoloured, it has a charming Renaissance front. A high wall separates it from the street, and on this wall, which is divided by a large open gateway, are perched two overhanging turrets. The open gateway admits you to the court beyond, which the melancholy mansion erects itself, decorated also with turrets, with fine old windows, and with a beautiful tone of faded red brick and rusty stone. It is a charming encounter for a provincial by street, one of those accidents in the hope of which the traveller with a propensity for sketching, whether on a little paper block or on the tablets of his brain, decides to turn a corner at a venture. A brawny gendarme in his shirt sleeves was polishing his boots in the court. An ancient knotted vine, forlorn of its clusters, hung itself over a doorway and dropped its shadow on the rough grain of the wall. The place was very sketchable. I am sorry to say, however, that it was almost the only bit. Various other curious old houses are supposed to exist at Bourges, and I wandered vaguely about in search of them, but I had little success, and I ended by becoming sceptical. Bourges is a ville de province in the full force of the term, especially as applied invidiously. The streets, narrow, tortuous, and dirty, have very wide cobblestones. The houses, for the most part, are shabby, without local colour. The look of things is neither modern nor antique, a kind of mediocrity of middle age. There is an enormous number of blank walls, walls of gardens, of courts, of private houses, that avert themselves from the street, as if in natural chagrin at there being so little to see. Round about is a flat, dull, featureless country, on which the magnificent cathedral looks down. There is a peculiar dullness and ugliness in a French town of this type, which, I must immediately add, is not the most frequent one. In Italy everything has a charm, a colour, a grace, even desolation and ennui. In England a cathedral city may be sleepy, but it is pretty sure to be mellow. In the course of 6 weeks spent en Provence, however, I saw few places that had not more expression than Bourges. I went back to the cathedral. That, after all, was a feature. Then I returned to my hotel, where it was time to dine, and sat down as usual with the commis voyageurs, who cut their bread on their thumb and partook of every course. And after this repast I repaired for a while to the cafe, which occupied a part of the basement of the inn and opened into its court. This cafe was a friendly, homely, sociable spot, where it seemed the habit of the master of the establishment to tutoyer his customers, and the practice of the customers to tutoyer the waiter. Under these circumstances the waiter of course felt justified in sitting down at the same table with the gentleman who had come in and asked him for writing materials. He served this gentleman with a horrible little portfolio, covered with shiny black cloth, and accompanied with 2 sheets of thin paper, 3 wafers, and one of those instruments of torture which pass in France for pens, these being the utensils invariably evoked by such a request. And then, finding himself at leisure, he placed himself opposite and began to write a letter of his own. This trifling incident reminded me afresh that France is a democratic country. I think I received an admonition to the same effect from the free, familiar way in which the game of whist was going on just behind me. It was attended with a great deal of noisy pleasantry, flavoured every now and then with a dash of irritation. There was a young man of whom I made a note. He was such a beautiful specimen of his class. Sometimes he was very facetious, chattering, joking, punning, showing off. Then, as the game went on and he lost, and he had to pay the consommation, he dropped his amiability, slanged his partner, declared he wouldn't play any more, and went away in a fury. Nothing could be more perfect or more amusing than the contrast. The manner of the whole affair was such as I apprehend one would not have seen among our English-speaking people, both the jauntiness of the first phase and the petulance of the second. To hold the balance straight, however, I may remark that if the men were all fearful cads, they were, with their cigarettes and their inconsistency, less heavy, less brutal than our dear English-speaking cad, just as the bright little cafe where a robust mater familias, doling out sugar and darning a stocking, sat in her place under the mirror behind the comptoir, was a much more civilized spot than a British public-house or a commercial room with pipes and whisky, or even than an American saloon. Chapter 13. It was very certain that when I left Tours for Le Mans it was a journey and not an excursion, for I had no intention of coming back. The question, indeed, was to get away, no easy matter in France in the early days of October, when the whole jeunesse of the country is going back to school. It is accompanied apparently with parents and grandparents, and it fills the trains with little pale-faced lyceens, who gaze out of the windows with a longing, lingering air, not unnatural on the part of small members of a race in which life is intense, who are about to be restored to those big educative barracks that do such violence to our American appreciation of the opportunities of boyhood. The train stopped every 5 minutes, but fortunately the country was charming, hilly and bosky, eminently good-humoured, and dotted here and there with a smart little chateau. The old capital of the province of the Maine, which has given its name to a great American state, is a fairly interesting town, but I confess that I found in it less than I expected to admire. My expectations had doubtless been my own fault. There is no particular reason why Le Mans should fascinate. It stands upon a hill, indeed a much better hill than the gentle swell of Bourges. This hill, however, is not steep in all directions. From the railway, as I arrived, it was not even perceptible. Since I am making comparisons, I may remark that, on the other hand, the Boule d'Or at Le Mans is an appreciably better inn than the Boule d'Or at Bourges. It looks out upon a small market-place, which has a certain amount of character and seems to be slipping down the slope on which it lies, though it has in the middle an ugly halle, or circular market-house, to keep it in position. At Le Mans, as at Bourges, my first business was with the cathedral, to which I lost no time in directing my steps. It suffered by juxtaposition to the great church I had seen a few days before, yet it has some noble features. It stands on the edge of the eminence of the town, which falls straight away on two sides of it, and makes a striking mass, bristling behind, as you see it from below, with rather small but singularly numerous flying buttresses. On my way to it I happened to walk through the one street which contains a few ancient and curious houses, a very crooked and untidy lane of really medieval aspect, honoured with the denomination of the Grand Rue. Here is the house of Queen Berengaria, an absurd name, as the building is of a date some 300 years later than the wife of Richard Coeur de Lion, who has a very sepulchral monument in the south aisle of the cathedral. The structure in question, very sketchable if the sketcher could get far enough away from it, is an elaborate little dusky facade overhanging the street, ornamented with panels of stone which are covered with delicate Renaissance sculpture. A fat old woman standing in the door of a small grocer's shop next to it, a most gracious old woman with a bristling moustache and a charming manner, told me what the house was, and also indicated to me a rotten-looking brown wooden mansion in the same street, nearer the cathedral, as the Maison Scarron. The author of the Roman Comique and of 1,000 facetious verses enjoyed for some years, in the early part of his life, a benefice in the cathedral of Le Mans, which gave him a right to reside in one of the canonical houses. He was rather an odd canon, but his history is a combination of oddities. He wooed the comic muse from the armchair of a cripple, and in the same position (he was unable even to go down on his knees) prosecuted that other suit which made him the first husband of a lady of whom Louis XIV. Was to be the second. There was little of comedy in the future Madame de Maintenon, although, after all, there was doubtless as much as there needed to have been in the wife of a poor man who was moved to compose for his tomb such an epitaph as this, which I quote from the BIOGRAPHY universelle. Celui qu'ici maintenant dort fit plus de pitié que d'envie, et souffrit 1000 fois la mort avant que de perdre la vie. Passons, ne fais ici de bruit, et garde bien qu'il ne s'éveille, car voici la première nuit que le pauvre Scarron sommeille. There is rather a quiet, satisfactory place in front of the cathedral, with some good bits in it, notably a turret at the angle of one of the towers, and a very fine steep-roofed building, behind low walls which it overlooks, with a tall iron gate. This house has two or three little pointed towers, a big black precipitous roof, and a general air of having had a history. There are houses which are scenes, and there are houses which are only houses. The trouble with the domestic architecture of the United States is that it is not scenic, thank heaven; and the good fortune of an old structure like the turreted mansion on the hillside of Le Mans is that it is not simply a house. It is a person, as it were, as well. It would be well indeed if it might have communicated a little of its personality to the front of the cathedral, which has none of its own. Shabby, rusty, unfinished, this front has a Romanesque portal, but nothing in the way of a tower. One sees from without, at a glance, the peculiarity of the church, the disparity between the Romanesque nave, which is small and of the 12th century, and the immense and splendid transepts and choir of a period 100 years later. Outside, this end of the church rises far above the nave, which looks merely like a long porch leading to it, with a small and curious Romanesque porch in its own south flank. The transepts, shallow but very lofty, display to the spectators in the place the reach of their two clerestory windows, which occupy above the whole expanse of the wall. The south transept terminates in a sort of tower, which is the only one of which the cathedral can boast. Within, the effect of the choir is superb. It is a church in itself, with the nave simply for a point of view. As I stood there, I read in my Murray that it has the stamp of the date of the perfection of pointed Gothic, and I found nothing to object to in the remark. It suffers little by confrontation with Bourges, and taken in itself seems to me quite as fine. A passage of double aisles surrounds it, with the arches that divide them supported on very thick round columns, not clustered. There are 12 chapels in this passage, and a charming little lady chapel filled with gorgeous old glass. The sustained height of this almost detached choir is very noble. Its lightness and grace, its soaring symmetry, carry the eye up to places in the air from which it is slow to descend. Like Tours, like Chartres, like Bourges, apparently like all the French cathedrals, and unlike several English ones, Le Mans is rich in splendid glass. The beautiful upper windows of the choir make, far aloft, a sort of gallery of pictures blooming with vivid colour. It is the south transept that contains the formless image, a clumsy stone woman lying on her back, which purports to represent Queen Berengaria aforesaid. The view of the cathedral from the rear is, as usual, very fine. A small garden behind it masks its base, but you descend the hill to a large Place de Foire, adjacent to a fine old public promenade which is known as Les Jacobins, a sort of miniature Tuileries, where I strolled for a while in the rectangular alleys, destitute of herbage, and received a deeper impression of vanished things. The cathedral, on the pedestal of its hill, looks considerably farther than the fair ground and the Jacobins, between the rather bare poles of whose straightly planted trees you may admire it at a convenient distance. I admired it till I thought I should remember it, better than the event has proved, and then I wandered away and looked at another curious old church, Notre Dame de la Couture. This sacred edifice made a picture for 10 minutes, but the picture has faded now. I reconstruct a yellowish brown facade and a portal fretted with early sculptures, but the details have gone the way of all incomplete sensations. After you have stood a while in the choir of the cathedral, there is no sensation at Le Mans that goes very far. For some reason not now to be traced, I had looked for more than this. I think the reason was to some extent simply in the name of the place, for names, on the whole, whether they be good reasons or not, are very active ones. Le Mans, if I'm not mistaken, has a sturdy, feudal sound, suggesting something dark and square, a vision of old ramparts and gates. Perhaps I had been unduly impressed by the fact, accidentally revealed to me, that Henry II, first of the English Plantagenets, was born there. Of course, it is easy to assure oneself in advance, but does it not often happen that one had rather not be assured? There is a pleasure sometimes in running the risk of disappointment. I took mine, such as it was, quietly enough, while I sat before dinner at the door of one of the cafes in the market place, with a bitter et curaçao, invaluable pretext at such an hour, to keep me company. I remember that in this situation there came over me an impression which both included and excluded all possible disappointments. The afternoon was warm and still, the air was admirably soft. The good Monceaux, in little groups and pairs, were seated near me, my ear was soothed by the fine shades of French enunciation, by the detached syllables of that perfect tongue. There was nothing in particular in the prospect to charm; it was an average French view. Yet I felt a charm, a kind of sympathy, a sense of the completeness of French life and of the lightness and brightness of the social air, together with the desire to arrive at friendly judgments, to express a positive interest. I know not why this transcendental mood should have descended upon me then and there, but that idle half hour in front of the cafe, in the mild October afternoon, suffused with human sounds, is perhaps the most definite thing I brought away from Le Mans. Section 7.